I saw the face of the holiest man in the city writhing in the fire, and what hurt me most wasn't seeing his suffering, but knowing that I helped him get there. For years, people looked at me with respect as I walked through the streets of Monterey, admiring the buildings I designed, the steel and glass structures that touched the sky under that relentless northern sun. No one knew that the foundations of my own life were rotten, made of silence and complicity. My name is Roberto, and although I sign documents as an architect and manage multi-million-dollar projects, the true story of my downfall began behind the wheel of a black sedan when I was just a driver. At 22, I got the job everyone in my church envied. I became Pastor Damien's personal driver. To the world, he was a prophet, an impeccable man of God. To me, at first, he was too. I remember the first day I got into that luxury car. The smell of new leather and air conditioning, feeling chosen. I thought being near him would bring me blessings, that his holiness would cling to me like perfume. How wrong I was. As the months went by, the routes changed. I started taking him to discreet hotels in secluded areas, to dimly lit restaurants where he met with people who weren't his wife. I saw him get out of the car, straighten his suit, put on those dark glasses, and transform. The man who preached about the sanctity of marriage on Sundays was the same one I dropped off at the doors of dens of iniquity on Tuesday nights, and I would stay in the parking lot with the engine running, waiting. That's the worst kind of sin, I think, the sin of the one who holds the ladder. I didn't do the things he did, but I paved the way for him. I was the keeper of his secrets. I remember one night in particular. It was pouring rain in Monterey. He got into the car, smelling of alcohol and cheap cologne. With a vacant stare, he looked at me in the rearview mirror and, in a slurred voice, told me I was a good boy, that I was loyal. He took out a thick wad of bills and put it in the passenger seat. He told me he knew that I wanted to study, that I had a talent for drawing, that he could help me become an architect if I continued to be discreet. At that moment I had a choice. I could have gotten out of the car, I could have quit, I could have sought the truth. But I looked at the money and then I looked at my own reflection in the mirror. I saw the poor boy who didn't want to return to poverty and I accepted. I took the money and sold my conscience. The years passed, he kept his word and I kept my silence. I graduated with honors. I stopped being his driver and I became the architect who designed his expansions. I designed the new auditorium, a monstrosity of concrete and lights capable of holding 10,000 people. Every beam I drew, every blueprint I signed, was financed with the money of widows and the poor who gave everything they had, believing in a man who mocked them in private. I knew it, I knew who he really was and I said nothing. I convinced myself that my success was a blessing, ignoring that silence also pays, and pays very well until it's time to collect. The day I died was a hot, dry Tuesday, typical of the North. I was supervising a new construction project, an office complex in the most expensive area of the city. I felt untouchable. I went up to the 5th floor, an open structure, just a steel skeleton and floors of fresh concrete. As I walked along the edge, I felt a strange wind. It wasn't the hot wind of the city, it was a cold breeze that made my skin crawl. I stopped and looked down at the street, where the cars looked like toys. For a second, a terrifying thought crossed my mind. A voice whispered in my ear, "Your time is up." I shook my head, laughing at my own nervousness. How could my time be up? I was at the peak of my career, young, strong. I had everything under control. I took a step toward the outer scaffolding for a better view. It was a temporary platform held up by thick steel cables, and I had inspected it myself that morning. But in the spiritual world, the laws of physics submit to higher decrees. I put my weight on the platform and without warning, without the usual creaking of fatigued metal, the main support gave way. The ground disappeared beneath my boots. My hands released the blueprints and desperately searched for something to hold on to, but only grasped at air. The impact didn't hurt, that's the truth. The brain shuts down before it can process the trauma. There was simply a sharp thud, absolute darkness, and total silence. I became a naked soul, stripped of suits, bank accounts, and excuses. I thought I would see a light. I thought that despite everything, I was a believer, a man who attended church, who tithed, who built temples. I expected to see angels or at least a tunnel of peace, but what greeted me was a dense, heavy blackness, as if I had been buried alive in tar, and the heat wasn't the heat of Monterey, it was a heat that didn't burn the skin, but burned the memory, the consciousness. I began to fall not toward the ground, but into the earth, piercing through layers of reality, descending at a speed that made me dizzy, and then I began to hear voices, heart-wrenching screams, howls of pain that didn't seem human, or perhaps they were all too human, filled with a suffering that has no end. "Welcome, Builder," whispered a voice right beside me, a voice that sounded like stones scraping against metal. Fear paralyzed me. There was no God in this place, there was no hope, there was only a brutal certainty. I was dead and I had been wrong about everything. My whole life had been a false construction, a beautiful facade without foundations, and I was on the way to hell. The fall continued endless, suffocating. The smell of sulfur and rotten flesh began to fill my spiritual nostrils, and then the total darkness began to be tinged with a dark red, an agonizing glow that came from below. I began to see shapes, shadows that moved in that reddish gloom. I landed on a surface hard, hot, and rough, like newly solidified volcanic rock. The ground vibrated with the sound of millions of subterranean screams, as if the earth itself were made of compressed souls. I looked up, waiting. I imagined demons with pitchforks, like in cartoons. How naive I was. What I saw was far worse. I saw a desolate landscape, an endless plain of ash and fire beneath a starless sky, a sky of black smoke and lead, and in the distance, silhouetted against the horizon of flames, I saw a structure. My heart stopped. As an architect, I recognized the lines immediately. I recognized the shape of the dome, the height of the towers, the layout of the main entrance. It was impossible. That structure rising in the midst of hell was my church, the temple I had designed, the pride of my career, but it wasn't made of concrete and glass. It was made of something that moved, something organic and horrifying. The walls throbbed, and instead of a cross at the summit, black fire erupted like an industrial chimney. God was showing me my work as he saw it, not as a monument to faith, but as a monument to human hypocrisy. I arrived at the enormous doors of the temple. On earth they were of exquisitely carved wood, here they were of bone and red-hot iron. They opened by themselves with a screech that sounded like a bone breaking, and the smell that wafted out from within made me fall to my knees. It was the smell of my past, the smell of concentrated sin. I entered, and what I saw inside changed my existence forever. The columns I had designed to appear majestic and lift my gaze to the heavens, here curved inward, like the broken ribs of a giant agonizing, pushing the ceiling down to crush us. The floor was a viscous, hot, pulsating mixture. With each step I took, my feet sank a few inches into a substance that felt like raw flesh. The walls were made of faces, thousands of faces fused into the masonry, their mouths open in a silent, eternal scream, and then the walls began to project images. Hell is the museum of your mistakes. I saw my own young hands gripping the leather steering wheel. I saw the watch on my wrist reading 2 a.m. I saw myself waiting outside a motel on the highway. The image was so real I could smell the cheap pine air freshener I used to mask the smell of cigarettes and women's perfume left behind by the pastor. "You knew and kept quiet," whispered a shadow that detached itself from the nearest column. It wasn't a horned demon, it was a long, deformed shadow, shaped like a broken liquor bottle. Behind it, another shadow emerged in the form of a briefcase that opened and closed like a hungry mouth, scattering fiery coins that burned the ground on contact. I understood with horror that these weren't generic monsters, they were the spirits of the vices I had carried. I didn't drink, but I drove the car so he could drink. I didn't steal directly, but I carried the briefcase. I was the cog that made the machine of sin work, and now that machine was devouring me. Burning papers began to fall from the black smoke-filled ceiling. They were my blueprints. Hundreds of blue sheets fell, burning. They were the temple designs, the forged building permits, the inflated invoices I had approved to embezzle funds. Every piece of paper that touched my skin burned like acid. Corruption, One said as it burned my arm, "Bribery," another said as it stuck to my face, "Silence," said the largest one, which fell right on my heart, branding me like cattle. I understood that I hadn't built a church for God, I had built a hideout for evil. Every brick I laid, every batch of cement I oversaw, had been an offering to vanity and lies. Then, a new sound cut through the air. It was a metallic, rhythmic sound, like a hammer striking an anvil with a desperate cadence. It came from the center of the temple, from the place where the altar should be. I walked down the central aisle, which felt endless, passing rows of pews made of iron thorns where gray souls writhed, unable to rise. As I approached the sanctuary, the temperature rose dramatically, and there, in the Holy of Holies of my perverted design, I saw what my soul feared most of all. There was no cross, no communion table. There was a pulpit, an enormous pulpit forged from black iron that glowed red hot, and chained to that pulpit, fused with the boiling metal, was him. I recognized him immediately, even though his skin was charred and his Italian suit was in flames. He was the man I served, he was the man for whom I sold my integrity. The chains didn't just bind him, they pierced him, welding him to the red-hot pulpit. Metal and flesh were one in an abominable union. I saw him gasp for air. It was an agonizing gesture, as if inhaling that sulphurous air were swallowing broken glass. His chest heaved with a superhuman effort, and then he opened his mouth. "Bring the tithes to the storehouse," he roared with a voice that sounded broken, like gravel being ground in a blender. It was his most famous sermon, the prosperity sermon, the same one I had heard him repeat hundreds of times. The moment he uttered the word tithes, his mouth contorted, from his cracked lips gushed a torrent of fat, black worms, glistening with boiling oil. The pastor tried to spit them out, tried to close his mouth, but an invisible force compelled him to keep speaking. He, who had used his mouth to twist the truth, now had a mouth that produced filth and fire. Every lie he had told on earth materialized here as physical torture. In front of him, in the first rows of pews made of blades, sat an audience of demons with exaggerated attention, mockingly mimicking the faithful who used to fill his church. When the pastor vomited worms, the demons erupted into applause. The sound of that applause was not like that of human hands, it sounded like bones breaking, a dry, rhythmic crack. "Amen, hallelujah, preach, prophet, preach." One of them howled, his jaw so dislocated it hung down to his chest. The pastor stared at them, his eyes wide with terror. He knew they weren't worshipping him, they were mocking him. For years he had loved the applause of the crowd, he had fed on fame, he had lived for the spectacle, and now hell was giving him exactly what he wanted, an eternal audience that never left, a show that never ended. Then the pastor lowered his head, panting, threads of saliva and ash hanging from his mouth, and slowly raised his gaze. His eyes scanned the dark nave and fixed directly on the column where I was hiding. He saw me. Despite the distance, despite the darkness, despite the pain that blinded him, his eyes found mine. I saw his lips move, forming my name without sound, Roberto. The pastor stretched out a hand toward me, a hand dripping molten metal, pointing at me with an accusing finger that trembled violently. "You!" he shouted, and his voice resonated with an unnatural clarity. "You brought me here." The demons turned their heads, hundreds of yellow and red eyes turned toward me at once. The anonymity was over, an invisible force pushed me forward, toward the light of the fire, toward the center of Tehi's stage. I was no longer the architect observing the work from afar, now I was part of the cast. "Come here, Core," the pastor bellowed, "come collect your pay." I reached the foot of the pulpit. I looked up at the man who had been my boss, my idol, and my source of income. He looked at me with a mixture of hatred and pleading. "You knew," he roared, stretching his neck so far his tendons looked like they were about to burst. "You saw the women, you had the bags of money. Why didn't you stop me? Why didn't you say anything? Were you my brother?" Those words struck me harder than any whip. Why didn't you stop me? That is the question that echoes through eternity, for all of us who remain silent in the face of sin. I wanted to shout at him that he was the pastor, that he should know better, that I was just an employee, but in this place of absolute truth, excuses evaporate. Then the pastor pointed at me, his eyes filled with tears of blood that evaporated as they touched his hot cheeks. That night in the downtown hotel, the girl was 17, he shouted, and the fire around him turned a sickly violet. You waited outside, Roberto. You turned up the radio so you wouldn't hear, but you did. You heard her cries and did nothing. I fell to my knees. The memory hit me like a train. Yes, I remembered. I had turned up the volume of the Christian music to drown out reality. I had used hymns to silence my conscience. I had told myself it wasn't my problem, but it was. By doing nothing, I had become the guardian of that atrocity. Guilt in hell isn't a feeling, it's a substance. I felt myself drowning in it. Suddenly, the torture changed. I saw the pastor's skin begin to glow with a metallic gold. I remembered how much he loved gold, rings on every finger, thick chains under his shirt, watches that cost more than my parents' house. He preached that gold was a sign of God's blessing. Now that twisted theology was manifesting physically. The metal of the pulpit began to ooze molten gold mixed with lead, a thick, lethal liquid that began to rise up his legs, covering him like a second skin. He howled. The sound was so high-pitched that the demons themselves covered their deformed ears. "This is what you wanted," a voice shouted from the darkness, a voice that sounded like the clinking of coins. "You lined your pockets in life, line them now in death." The pastor looked at me through the molten gold mask that was beginning to cover his face. His eyes were two wells of infinite despair. "You took your cut too," he spat at me, throwing drops of boiling metal. "You built this with your architecture and your plans. Every brick of that temple you paid for with my sin. You are as much a thief as I am." I stumbled backward. I wanted to deny it. His words. I wanted to tell him that I worked honestly, that my plans were perfect. But memory, that relentless prosecutor, opened the file in my mind. His words. I wanted to tell him that I worked honestly, that my plans were perfect. But memory, that relentless prosecutor, opened the file in my mind. I remembered the day I designed the pastor's private office. He asked me for a secret entrance, a door that didn't appear on the official plans, that connected directly to the private parking lot. He told me it was for security. I knew that wasn't true. I knew it was to move things and people in and out without being seen, and I drew it. I built it. I put my signature on that plan. Remembering it, I felt a sharp pain in my right hand. I looked down and screamed. My hand, the hand with which I drew, the hand that held the steering wheel, was black. It was being charred. My fingers were turning to charcoal, crumbling like ash. The pastor kept confessing, shouting, vomiting secrets I had locked away for years. The demons cried out for judgment. The skeletal demon holding my construction helmet dropped it to the ground and crushed it with its claw, shattering it into 1,000 pieces of white plastic that melted onto the boiling rock. "Your turn, architect," it said, its voice like stones falling into a grave. "You have built many houses on earth. Let's see what you have built for yourself down here." They surrounded me. There were hundreds of them. I felt their physical hatred, a crushing pressure on my chest. They pushed me. I fell to my knees, hitting the scorching ground. At that moment, lying on the floor of hell, surrounded by monsters who knew every one of my sins, I felt smaller than a grain of sand. My pride as an architect crumbled. What good were my awards? What good was it to have designed the largest temple in the city if my soul was in ruins? I understood that I was not a victim. I wasn't here by mistake. I deserved this. That is the hardest revelation, to accept that the sentence is just. I remembered my mother. I remembered her prayers in the small kitchen of our poor house before I became important. I remembered as she knelt on the cold cement floor and cried out to God, not for money, not for fame, but for mercy. I had mocked that little thing. I wanted complex theology. I wanted big buildings. I wanted a gospel that would give me status. But now in the lion's den, I understood that my mother's faith was the only truth that mattered. A demon grabbed my arm. Its claws sank into my spiritual flesh, burning me like branding irons on cattle. I resisted, not with physical strength, because I had none, but with willpower. I sank my knees to the burning ground. I closed my eyes. blocking out the sight of the deformed faces, blocking out the fire, blocking out the condemned pastor. I isolated myself in my own inner darkness. I knew I had no right to ask for anything. I had been a hypocrite, I had been an accomplice, but I also knew that if there was a way out, it wasn't in my works, nor in my excuses, nor in my money. It was in a name I had heard mentioned thousands of times in empty sermons, but which I had never uttered with a broken heart. I felt the claws of the demons multiplying over me, scratching me, pulling at me. The pain was unbearable, an agony that made me want to cease to exist, but in the midst of that pain, I took a breath of that sulphurous, rotten air, filled my burning lungs, and screamed. It wasn't a scream of fear, it was a scream of surrender. Jesus, the name burst from my throat like thunder. I didn't say it like a magic word, I said it like a son who is drowning and calls out to his father. I said it acknowledging that he was everything and I was nothing. I said it renouncing my degree as an architect, my past as a driver, my money, my life, everything. Jesus, forgive me, I screamed again, louder, with an emotional violence that tore me apart inside. Too am a sinner, save me. The instant that holy name left my lips with genuine repentance, the atmosphere shifted violently. The demons holding me captive let out a shriek of pain, as if the sound of that name were acid to their ears. They released me abruptly, recoiling and covering their heads with their long, deformed arms. Shut up. Don't say it, howled the demon with the keys, writhing on the floor like a trampled snake, but I didn't shut up. I kept screaming, weeping, pouring out my soul onto that cursed floor. The structure of the infernal cathedral began to tremble, the bone columns creaked and began to crack, the ceiling of solid darkness, which had seemed impenetrable, began to vibrate. The pastor, from his metal prison, raised his head. He stared at me with astonishment and terror. He couldn't say the name, his heart was too hardened, too full of pride and self-justification, but I had broken, and through that crack in my pride, the light could enter. A deafening roar shook the abyss. It was like the sound of a barrier shattering. The black ceiling ripped open, a crack of pure, white, blinding light pierced the eternal darkness. It wasn't sunlight, it was a living light, a light with weight, with authority. That light fell like lightning, ignoring the demons, ignoring the pastor, and struck me directly. It didn't burn, on the contrary, where the light touched my spiritual skin, the pain vanished. The suffocating heat of hell evaporated in an instant, replaced by a coolness that smelled of rain, of ozone, of life. I felt a force that didn't come from below, but from above. An invisible, yet infinitely strong, hand seized my spirit. I felt a pull upward, violent and loving at the same time. "It's not ours!" shouted their demons, leaping toward me, trying to grab my ankles, but the light formed a wall around me. When they tried to touch that light, their claws disintegrated. They shrieked and fled into the shadows, unable to bear the purity of that presence. I began to ascend, leaving the floor of flesh, leaving the pews of blades. Flying over the altar, I saw Pastor Damien for the last time. He watched me as I ascended, and in his face I saw the most painful realization of all. He could have been saved, he could have cried out, but he loved his glory more than the glory of God, and now he was left behind. I watched him shrink, a miserable golden dot in the darkness, until the darkness swallowed him again. I ascended at a dizzying speed. I passed through the layers of the earth, through the dense darkness, through the fear, and as I ascended, I felt something tear away from me. The guilt was falling away, the shame of the silent driver was falling away, the arrogance of the corrupt architect was falling away. I was being cleansed. I heard a voice that resonated in every atom of my being, a voice that sounded like many waters. "I'm giving you another chance, Roberto, not so that you build buildings, but so that you build testimony." The light became so intense that I lost all sense of myself. I only knew that I was safe. I knew that Jesus had heard me, and then everything stopped with a sharp crack. I opened my eyes. The pain returned suddenly, but it was a different kind of pain. It was physical pain. the pain of broken bones, of scraped skin, of blood. I heard sirens, I heard men shouting, I tasted the metallic tang of blood in my mouth. He's alive, bring the stretcher, the architect is alive. I saw the blue sky of Monterey above me, a pale sky, full of dust and sun. I had never seen anything so beautiful. I was back, my body was shattered, I had multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and a collapsed lung. According to the doctors said I should have died on impact. The fall from that height onto reinforced concrete was fatal in 99% of cases. But I knew the truth, I had died, I had gone to that place of torment and returned. While the paramedic cut open my shirt and put an oxygen mask on me, I wept. I wasn't crying from the pain of my broken legs, I was crying because the sky was blue, I was crying because I had air in my lungs, I was crying because God, in His infinite and incomprehensible mercy, had decided to pull a miserable con man from the bottom of the pit. I looked at my right hand, the one I had seen charred in hell. It was there, broken, bruised, covered in blood and dirt, but it was whole. I moved my fingers slowly, and in that movement, I made a promise. Never again would that hand draw a lie, never again would that hand receive dirty money, never again would that hand lead a man into sin. When I was finally able to speak, the first thing I did was ask about him. I needed to confirm what my spiritual eyes had seen. With a raspy voice, I asked my wife, who was weeping beside me, what had happened to Pastor Damien. She turned pale and squeezed my hand. She told me that a month ago, on the same day as my accident, the pastor had suffered a massive heart attack in his private office. They found him dead, his face contorted with terror, clutching his checkbook. Hearing this, a chill that didn't come from the air conditioning ran down my spine. There was no satisfaction in knowing this, only a deep and terrifying sadness. My vision hadn't been a hallucination from the impact. I had seen him in his final destination. He had arrived at the place he built with his lies, and I had been on the verge of staying with him forever. Today my life is completely different. I no longer build glass buildings that touch the clouds. Now I go to prisons, to hospitals, to neighborhoods where people have lost hope. I tell them my story. I don't talk to them about religion, I'm talking about reality. And now I want to talk to you. Maybe you think you're a good person because you don't kill and don't steal. I thought so too. I was a respected professional, a family man, an active member of the church, but I had a secret. I was complicit in sin. And that silence almost cost me eternity. Hell isn't a medieval myth to scare children. It's a real place, of absolute solitude, of physical pain, and, worst of all, of eternal memory. You will remember every opportunity you had to repent and didn't take. You will remember this moment. You'll remember that someone who came back from the dead warned you. Don't make my mistake. Don't wait for the scaffolding to break beneath your feet. Don't wait for your heart to fail you. Tomorrow isn't guaranteed. I thought I had 40 more years to live, and in a second I was falling into the abyss. If you feel your life is a facade, if you know there are rotten foundations in your heart, if you're living a double life like I did, stop now. Don't keep building on sand. The building will collapse, and when it does, it will be too late to look for new blueprints. Jesus is real, His forgiveness is real. I am living proof that His mercy can reach someone even at the gates of hell. He heard my desperate cry when the demons were already celebrating my arrival. He can hear you right now, right there, in your room, in your office, in your car. You don't need a luxurious temple, you don't need a famous intermediary, you only need a contrite and humble heart. Talk to Him, tell Him the truth, renounce your secrets before your secrets condemn you. I am no longer the man who drove the car of sin, now I am a witness of the light, and my prayer is that this testimony will be the blueprint you use to rebuild your life on the eternal rock. Don't gamble with your salvation, escape for your life, because time is short and eternity is too long to spend it wrong. M.